Good afternoon, everybody. Happy August. Hope you guys are doing well. Let's do a little more work building up this hype train. Let's do a little bit more work pumping coal into this locomotive engine. And I'm talking about the locomotive engine of hype that is the Seattle Seahawks wide receiver core going into the 2023 NFL season. So, this has been the one unit that has consistently built expectations and hype and met or surpassed them throughout this offseason. I don't need to sell anybody on DK Metcalf, who is off to one of the best starts of any wide receiver in NFL history. Go look at the numbers if you don't believe me, by the way. First 4 seasons of his career compared to any receiver's first 4 seasons, it's up there. It's right up there. And Lockett, the way Lockett's been playing hyper efficient, hyper effective football for several years now, what, half a decade basically of hyper efficient football. Yeah, I don't need to sell you guys on those guys. We know what they can do. Whether or not they do it in training camp doesn't really matter. We know what they can do when the games start, but if there's been one thing this offseason that has been undefeated, and I've talked about this before, but it's been Jackson Smith. It's been JSN. I got this tweet up here from a couple days ago. A crazy good toe-tapping touchdown that he made in training camp. And it seems like we can't go a day without him doing something. Like yesterday he was killing it in the one-on-ones. The day before he's killing it in 7-on-7. OTAs, he's killing it. Mini camps, he's killing it. Off-season work with Gino at his house or whatever, that he's killing it. And it just keeps on going and going and going. And as somebody who liked the pick of JSN but didn't necessarily love it, it's tough to get away from this hype machine at this point. Like, this is happening. This is happening. He is doing some special things right now. And you put those three elements together. We know what we're getting from DK. We know what we're getting from Lockett. And we're starting to feel like we can feel really good about what we're getting from JSN, because even though it's just the off season, he does it every single day. So to hype things up just a little bit more, I want to ask the question here, and I think I'm already kind of indicating what I think the answer is. Is this the best Seattle Seahawks receiver core ever? Because I've already talked about how it compares to other top receiver cores in the league. I think it's right up there in the top 3. But beyond just that, is this the best top 3 receiver room we have ever had? So I wanted to take a little trip down memory lane and take a look at the top 3 receivers that we've had each season since the team's inception in 1976. So it was kind of a cool opportunity to go back and take a look at some of the guys who made up the first few 3 receiver sets, which obviously was before my time by a pretty wide margin. In fact, the entire Largent era was before I was even born. So it was kind of cool to go back and take a look at some of the trios that we had. Now, I want to be clear about something. We're not talking about numbers so much, although obviously numbers are a big deal. We're talking about ability and performance, because back in the 70s, you didn't see as much 3 receiver sets as you do now. In fact, on a lot of these old Seahawks teams, our third best receiver did very little. There was one year I found where our third leading receiver, I mean a wide receiver, had 4 catches all season. So understand that this just isn't about, oh, they put up big numbers, therefore they're the best. No, it's not just about that. It's about who are actually the best. And I was looking through stuff, and you look early on, you see that the big trio, the big trio of the first several years of the Seahawks existence was, of course, Steve Largent. By the way, Steve Largent was the top receiver every year for the first, 11 years of the Seahawks existence. Pretty undefeated right there. But then you had Sam McCullum, who was the kind of the running mate of Largent for the first several years of the Seahawks existence. Then you actually had Steve Vrabel. Most years he would be the third receiver. And when somebody's the third receiver, understand that back in the 70s, it meant they caught like one pass a game, maybe. So, not a whole lot, but for the era, pretty good. It peaked in 1979, as near as I can tell. You had Largent entering his prime. You had Steve Rabel entering his prime. Not that he was a superstar in his prime, but it was, some of his best years. And then you had Sam McCullum in his prime. So 1979 was like the first time the Seahawks had anything approaching an elite receiver trio. And then you jump forward a little bit, Largent still killing it. We had Paul Johns be the number two guy for a couple years, but things peaked again a little bit in '84 when we brought in the young Daryl Turner, who started out his career very well for the Seahawks. Largent still kind of sort of in his prime at 30. Daryl Turner, new on the scene, 23 years old. And then you had Paul Johns, a pretty effective wide receiver three. This was the next time we had a really nice setup of three receivers on this team. 1984, which, of course, was one of the best years of the early Seahawks. Then after that, the rest of the 80s, I mean, we had some pretty decent years, but there was nothing really stand out to me. Largent was getting older. Daryl Turner faded kind of quickly and basically wasn't really part of the team for the rest of the 80s. Paul Skansky stuck around as a half decent number three option, but never really did anything to stand out. And then you get to the 90s, and there are some standout moments from the receivers in the 90s, although obviously it's muted by the fact that the team was just not that good. 1991 was actually a pretty good year. Brian Blades in his prime, 26 years old. Tommy Kane, who was actually a pretty nice piece of the offense in the very early 90s, 27 years old in his prime. And we were getting decent production out of a guy named Jeff Chadwick near the end of his career. So it was actually a pretty decent 1-2-3 punch, even though the offense was mostly punchless during this time. It didn't peak again until 1995, and this was probably the I don't know. 1995 might have been like the high point of the 90s, especially in terms of like offensive production. This was the year when we still believed Rick Meyer might be the guy. We still believed Dennis Erickson might be the guy. And you saw pretty good work from our top three receivers. Brian Blades, still good, not quite in his prime yet, but we were adding 24-year-old speedster Joey Galloway. This was the first year in Seahawks franchise history where we had 2,000-yard receivers. And then you had Rob Thomas, who wasn't much, but he was the third receiver, and he did fine. He did okay. And then in 1997, we turned the page a little bit on the Brian Blades era, and this was actually a low-key effective three-receiver trio. Receiver trio, I guess would be the right way to structure that. Joey Galloway entering his prime, Mike Pritchard in his prime. Mike Pritchard was actually a pretty forgotten but solid contributor to the receiver core in the late 90s. And then James McKnight, who was actually one of the early best wide receiver threes that the Seahawks had. He was maybe the first wide receiver three that was really kind of a standout in terms of his production. So that trio had a chance to be the group. It didn't happen, but Galloway, Pritchard, and McKnight seemed like they were going to really be something, and then it just didn't pan out. And then Holmgren came in and basically blew up the receiver room, and we were moving on to the next guys who 100% absolutely unequivocally should have been the wide receiver core to end all wide receiver cores in Seahawks history. These guys should have done it, and it just didn't happen. Started really, I guess, in 2001 with Darrell Jackson at 23, Corin Robinson at 21, and Bobby Engram at 28. These guys should have been awesome. You had Corin Robinson, a top 10 pick, incredibly talented. Like, we are talking Hall of Fame potential on this guy. He should have been one of the best receivers in NFL history. Should have been one of the best receivers the Seahawks ever had. Darrell Jackson, who had all the talent, produced big in several years of his career, but injuries just couldn't quite get out of the way for him. For Corin Robinson, just couldn't quite get his head on straight, I guess you could say. And then you had Bobby Engram, the great immortal Bobby Engram, as your number three receiver in his prime. Like, just the perfect slot receiver for the Mike Holmgren West Coast offense. So you had two young, super talented guys, and then you had the stable veteran holding it all down in his prime, in Bobby Engram. So this trio here should have been the ones. In 2002, that was probably about as good as they got. And then 2003, they did well too. Those were 2 years where we started to see what they could have been. And it could have been a really sweet half decade to decade, honestly. But after 2003, it just kind of fizzled, and we never quite got what we were sold back in 2001 when we got this group together. So this is definitely one of the ones that got away. And then over the rest of the Holmgren era, which was actually the successful era, the receivers were not quite as prolific a part of the offense. So to get to the next really impressive receiver group, you got to blow past the rest of the Holmgren era. Got to get through the early parts of the Pete Carroll era. We had some very lackluster receiver groups during this era. Mike Williams, Dion Butler, Ben Obomanu. All those guys would be out of the league not too long after this season, but they were the leading receivers for this 2010 team that made the playoffs. And there were some misses. There were some close misses in the early Russell Wilson era. Sidney Rice could have been part of a great receiver trio, but he got hurt. Golden Tate could have been a part of a great receiver trio, but we let him go off his rookie deal. Doug Baldwin obviously eventually ascended to the point where he was one of the best receivers in the league, but he was never part of a great unit. Like, we kind of got close in 2005 with Baldwin, Lockett, and Curse, but Lockett was still a rookie, and Curse was never like some superstar player. He was just a guy who did his job fairly well. So I didn't see anything special from this era. In 2016, it was really good, but then Lockett broke his leg at the end of the season, and Curse was starting to really fall off as a player. 2017 was Baldwin's kind of last really good year in the NFL. Lockett was good, but coming off an injury. Paul Richardson finally put it together, but there's nothing great here quite yet. 2018, 2019. 2019, you're really close. You introduced DK Metcalf, but you're losing Doug Baldwin, so not quite yet. 2020, probably the best year the Seahawks have ever gotten from a top three receiver room, with Tyler Lockett being your number one, hyper efficient, hyper effective, 1,000 yards, 100 catches. DK Metcalf, best season of his career, coming into, I don't even want to say his prime, but it was his best season, and he was turning 23 this year, so you can't really call it his prime, but he's getting to the point where he's a more consistent impact player rather than somebody who is a rookie who some games would be there and some games wouldn't be. And then we actually got some pretty decent stuff out of David Moore, 25 years old. Not a super standout by any stretch, but better than some of the third receivers that we've had during the Holmgren, Carroll, and I guess Jim Mora Jr. era. And then you go to last year, and I loved this group. I think this group is right up there with the 2020 group, honestly. Metcalf was a little bit older. I know he didn't put up the same numbers, but in many ways he is a better player. You've got Tyler Lockett, who has lost something in terms of yak, but in terms of getting open, in terms of running routes, in terms of doing the day-to-day, snap-to-snap things that a receiver does, he's better than ever. And I loved Goodwin. I think that Goodwin on a per-snap basis was incredible, one of the better receivers in the league, but he just wasn't out there that much. And he wasn't there when we needed him at the end of the day. He got hurt like 3 different times, missed the end of the season, so it's tough. But these are probably the two best receiver rooms we've had, even accounting for era. But you take a look at this perfect spread that we now have in 2023, where Metcalf, entering his prime, theoretically, at 26 years old, should be putting together his best, most efficient seasons now. Lockett starting to exit his prime, and yet it just seems like he's just going to chug along far longer than it was suspected he would. So it's a great way to complement each other. And then you're throwing in JSN, the 21-year-old phenom that everyone's hyping up like crazy. So you've got a rookie, you've got a guy entering his prime, you've got a guy exiting his prime. It's like this perfect spread of experience levels and athleticism levels. Three guys who play completely differently. I don't think all three guys are going to have 1,000-yard seasons. In fact, I don't even know if two of them are going to have 1,000-yard seasons. But in terms of the players, in terms of the ability, feels like it's the best we've ever had. And honestly, if JSN lives up to even like 70% of the hype, it might not even be all that close. It might not even be all that competitive. Like 2022, 2020, and then probably 1997. That's what they got to beat. Probably 2002 as well. I think they can do that. I would expect that. Let me know what you guys think. But yeah, best receiver core in Seahawks history, maybe. Go Hawks.